And we are back with our regularly scheduled programming, Civil Offense.
Howdy.
My name is Ahmed Mlih. And today we're talking about subverting the state and ending social engineering through technology, because these things are not going to happen by making TikTok videos about anarcho-capitalism and Hoppa. I'm here with Douglas Terabyte of Backalley Philosophy. First of all, how are you, Doug?
I'm doing all right. Thank you for having me join today. I don't commonly join streams, so this is a new experience for me, and I hope it goes well.
Anything else you want to say to introduce yourself?
Oh boy, I don't know. I don't normally do introductions. I'm usually the shy one in the group, so I'm not sure. I guess I would say I'm a self-studied scientist. I am an anarchist. Mostly, I just focus on trying to study and think of how well. I would say I'm just trying to live. Honestly, I'm just trying to make my life work in a way that removes as many outside influences on pressuring me into doing something I don't want to do.
Yeah, I smile because imagine having to say that, right? Like, imagine having to say, I'm just trying to live. It's
like
it's something, right? It's
it's so hard to be able to make a life for yourself where you don't have to constantly pay to continue existing.
Yeah. And
yeah, I mean, you could go ahead and conform to the norms of behavior that end up emerging because the state defends political titles and property. But I mean, you're clinically alive, sure, but really all that you're going to be able to do is create a clone personality of a couple of different archetypes and live the same life that anybody else does, essentially outside of your own control. So clinically, I mean, sure, you have a pulse, your brain works. Well, for now it does. But yeah, I mean, existentially, does that really count as living?
Right. And he already introduced himself with that. What an introduction for him. We've got Esso, also Back Alley Philosophy here. How's it going, Esso?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty well. I'm in the same room with Doug, actually. So, pardon if there's any sort of feedback or interruption between the two of our microphones.
Feedback.
Yeah, this conversation was originally more so going to be Doug's than mine, because after the end of the first stream that I did here on Civil Offense, we talked offline, off the stream, for about an hour and a half about the nature of specific techniques and technologies that could be subversive to the state, and specifically why they are, which is what we're here to talk about today. And Doug's more specialized with actual equipment and building machines, whereas I'm more specialized in actually understanding social mechanics, we'll put it like that, and norms in society and how norms and behavior end up coming to be.
So we're probably going to be switching back and forth a lot on who's specialized in what. So back to what I was trying to say earlier, because I've now lost my train of thought.
Sorry.
It's all right. It's fine. It's Can you remind me what I just last said?
Esso, do you have that? Because it's honestly slipping my mind right now.
Well, you didn't really end up finishing what you were going to say in the middle of my introduction.
Yeah, I'm getting some feedback right now.
But you were just about to start talking about the nature of specific specialized traits that you have, like what you know best, right, and how that contributes to the stream.
Okay. I apologize for the blank, but I'm trying here. Not used to this. Trying to get better at it. So I don't know. Just start with one of the questions, then I guess, and I'll get into the flow.
Okay, first of all, just some announcements real quick. Make sure you go to my website, ahmedmlih.com, sign up for my email list if you don't mind sharing your email just to get the latest updates. But don't worry, because we've got the Civil Offense Discord server where you don't have to do that. Link in the description. That's actually where I update people on where the streams are, when they are, also on so forth. Pretty much live updates on it. And just make sure to go to Civil Offense. You can check it out. YouTube, Rumble, Amazon, Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Google Podcast. And we've got a few live chats here. We've got JC Armitage saying sup. We got Mr. Merchant in here. What's up? Legacy Zach, you guys are, or you are just a physical manifestation of the state straw man for you. I don't know about that.
What is that supposed to mean?
I don't know. Let's see. Oh, yeah, he had this. You just want to learn and live and be left alone. Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much.
Mr. Merchant, I don't know.
That's exactly it.
I don't know if you want to mention anything about this, but he said FNet when.
I can tell you that the original FNet project had been canceled because we lost all of the developers for it.
Okay.
We're replacing it with a different project that's going to attempt to achieve the same goal. We realized that just trying to fix the internet with if you want me to explain how the original project went, I can attempt to do that, because I actually became one of the head administrators of the project when I first met ESO. And let's just go to say that the previous people who were working with ESO kind of abandoned his project. And so he didn't have the skill necessary to do it himself. So I tried taking a swing at it. I brought in some of the programmers that I knew. So we realized we had to scrap the whole thing, because the previous attempt was, have you ever heard of something called CJDNS?
I have not.
All right. Off the top of my head, my memory might be wrong. Forgive me. It is supposed to be a distributed routing protocol, I think. And it was patched together with a script with something called IPFS, the Interplanetary File System Protocol. So it was not workable in its state. So we had to scrap that. But the idea of trying to actually replace the internet's infrastructure lived on. So after that, we tried a different project. We tried to make portable routers that could plug in via USB that would have something called OpenWRT flashed onto the firmware. We were just gonna give those out pre-set up to people, and they would have configuration that would make it so that they would connect together peer-to-peer. Now, we got kind of betrayed by one of the developers, who I will not mention, who deleted the source code because, quote, you're going to make it proprietary. Well, this is a paraphrase more. You're going to make it proprietary, and you're going to keep the code for people, and you're going to sell it to people, when really we were just going to sell pre-configured ones, but then give out the software for free.
Okay. Well, you also mentioned before some stuff about fixing the internet, and that's something we're going to get in later when we talk about copyright.
I'll explain. Sorry.
Yeah, just when we talk about copyright. But I did want to set the stage for the actual discussion that we're going to start off with, and that was something that ESO was going to go ahead and explain, and it was deconstructionism as a concept. So ESO, if you want to hop in, you could talk about that.
Okay, well, yeah, go. Yeah, so deconstructionism as a concept, it was brought up in a sort of, I guess, pre-show conversation that we had off air the other night, because Doug wanted to talk and prepare for the show because he isn't familiar with streaming, and fair enough. I mean, most people probably would be nervous, but digressing. So we've been, over the course of the last couple of months, writing this is more so Doug and Heretic's project until I brought this up, but they were in the process of trying to write a video critiquing the open software movement and critiquing the concept of intellectual property from a different angle than it's usually approached in most essays. Basically, instead of just making another video explaining why there obviously isn't such a thing as IP within the context of property as an ethical concept, they were taking the approach more so of trying to explain how the state even enforces IP in the first place, and what's the practical side of IP being enforced, even becoming a behavioral norm in modern societies. And they were for a couple of months off and on working on this script, but and this is related, but it's kind of a side tangent. So Cat, I've been talking with, he's another guest on this stream. I've been talking a lot. Yeah, I've been talking a lot with him over the last year about, and he's been recommending a lot of specifically a lot of post-structuralist philosophy, like Foucault, for example, or Derrida, specifically because a lot of the conclusions that I had come to about society's relationship to the state within the context of what libertarianism as a method implies strongly resembles or is essentially identical to a lot of the conclusions that thinkers like Foucault or Derrida came to. Foucault specifically, and the concept of power relations. But for example, I talked about that in the stream that we had at first, how you can identify what I've been calling leverage. You can identify that as essentially being identical to how Foucault describes power relations. But more recently, I read into the philosophy of Jacques Derrida, which is, the other thinker that I just mentioned a second ago, who proposed the concept of deconstructionism, and that provided me Cat was essentially correct that in the way that I've been characterizing how behavioral norms are informed as far as what specific performative means go into causing them to be, and then using that as a way of observing how they're expressed, but also working backwards to see what causes them to be expressed in that way. That's essentially identical to how Jacques Derrida would go into describing a concept known as deconstructionism, but specifically within the context of deconstructionism, a concept known as a center of norms, or a centering of norms. And that's what we were talking about the other day.
Yeah, so what you talked about, specifically what I wrote down, was that you said norms and behaviors are defined by specific expressions, and what you mean by that are how technique emerges and what goes into property norms unique to that society. And then from that, you talked about a society center, which is basically what you went over now.
And that's what I wanted to clarify, is Jacques Derrida's conclusion wasn't based on the same epistemological foundation that I'm using, and he wasn't really referring to societies. He was referring more to communication, which is it's a concept that emerges within the study of societies because it entails more than one person conveying information to others. But that's digressing. And aesthetic was another concept that he was particularly concerned with. But essentially what I mean by expressions is the performed means that go into the behaviors that you can identify as norms of behavior in relative to specific subjects, like aesthetic, for example. And in the practical sense, how you can see an aesthetic norm expressing itself is, say, in the context of building architecture. what specifically would be the norm of architecture within that particular society is going to be gamified by what specific it's not like what specific end is reached as far as like how specifically something is designed. You can't specifically say, oh yes, this design is going to, like, this design specifically is what people are going to use. But you can look at the way that certain design philosophies emerge and the means that would go into like the technique that would be performed in causing that design to emerge, and you can say, yes, that's an expression of aesthetic norms that emerges out of a society with this basis of behavior that informs what counts as aesthetic, what informs that society's aesthetic norms. But that's a major difference between like, I'm only using this as essentially a framing device to help explain like what exactly libertarianism would imply about norms, or what specific, or how specifically to understand norms in a society in a way that would allow you to understand ends like freedom or an authoritarian society that would be implied by libertarianism as a method. Specifically, Jacques Derrida seemed to treat these concepts as though the relationship between them, as far as how one informs another, they kind of existed in a vacuum, or they don't really or the relationship between how one informs one another is not exactly clear. However, what's immediately obvious to me is that the primary norm that essentially influences all of the others, how all of the others are expressed, because the defining feature of every single social norm are consistent behaviors that can be performed and are incentivized, or they're, at the very least, there's no risk associated with them. It is property norms. A society's property norms are going to gamify all of the other norms of behavior that emerge in that society, because that literally determines what resources people can use and how people can use those resources.
You know, I've had somebody who, well, I guess he started out as a hoppy, and I'm not sure exactly. Well, he kind of became like neo-reactionary or like monarchist or whatever it is, right? But the point being, he actually uses that sort of same justification for why property norms need to be set by the state, so that, like, you don't have like somebody putting a dildo on top of their home and ruining society by doing that, because that's like a top-down thing.
Yeah, but that's an aesthetic preference. But the thing is, as far as property norms go, politically enforced property norms are a single end. Like, there's no difference between there's differences in how states defend their specific property norms, which are going to be gamified by their specific political economies and their access to resources, and what those states have to do to maintain control over the specific societies they're claiming. But ultimately, the defense of politically defined property norms is a single end defined by a single set of means. And that is the state putting itself into a position of leverage over how people access resources in that particular society, so that the state is just the unilateral arbiter of what counts as a dispute, what can be claimed, what can be defended, how people can associate, and so on.
Okay, so we got the Fox in here saying specifically, we live in a society of specific people that specifically use specific in a specific manner specifically. Okay.
Yeah, I didn't use that term for emphasis that many times.
Yeah, that was overkill. So yeah, I wanted to get into the last point, because I wasn't saying that you were saying you were the one saying basically that norms and behavior are defined. Like the definition I gave there was basically what you gave me as your view of it, right? So I kind of wanted to get into what a society center is really quick, because you touched on that at the end of what you were saying earlier. But basically, we want to figure out what that is, and what that exactly has to do with what we're talking about right now. And you also kind of explained it in what you just said, but I'll let you go ahead and give more of a specific definition.
Right. So there's a concept within deconstructionism that is essentially what I've been, as far as like how I would frame trying to explain this to another person, or trying to explain what's implied by libertarianism as a method. Like, as far the most straightforward way of describing like how exactly this would be practically expressed, or what the practical implications of this would be for action, or what it would look like, in other words, to actually see it in your empirical environment. There's a concept that Derrida describes in great detail within deconstructionism, known as a center, or centering. And what centering is, or the center, is essentially just when you consider all of the norms in behavior, or all of the norms around a specific subject, and what exact performed means go into defining how those norms are expressed, you can use this to identify a range of behaviors, or a range of specific subjects within the context of a specific range of a range of norms. You can use behaviors which face no resistance to the performed means, or the basis for a specific norm within a range of norms, as the way to identify what is essentially a social path of least resistance. So exactly I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought because of the Fox's message, but
sorry about that. I'm just putting up we'll answer that question later, Zach.
Yeah. So you can essentially identify the way that behavior, like your behavior, the people defining norms, or what's defining norms, if it's not artificial, if it doesn't have an artificial foundation, you can see the way that they're trying to socially engineer your behavior based on the range of behaviors that don't clash with the performative foundation of these norms of behavior and how they're being expressed.
Zach is saying, how would we define norms in society? Is he looking for a specific definition of norms themselves?
Specific behavioral norms. So what behaviors that are what behaviors being performed consistently within the range of a specific within the range of certain topics or subjects causes them to be definable based on what means go into performing the actions that define the norms.
Okay.
So like property norms, for example, how exactly is property practically expressed in that society? Well, you look at the means that would go into performing what is defined as property in that society, and then you would see how behavior, like what exactly allows behavior to be expressed in that specific way, where that is what counts as property. Within the context of property norms themselves, there is a center of norms. There's a center of behavior. Within the context of aesthetic norms, there's a center by the things that define aesthetic norms. Within any other, and that's the way that any other norm can be functionally identified.
Right. And so when we were talking about the libertarian method of achieving freedom, basically what you had brought up to me was the idea of creating economic networks so that people can remove the leverage over them. And you mentioned it's a subversive technique. So we kind of covered what that would mean, but there are technologies that obviously go into that. And Doug was mentioning to me as well that technologies can be disruptive but not subversive, which I thought was an interesting idea to hear from. So Doug, if you wanted to kind of mentioned to me, first of all, because we were talking about social engineering as well and the way to end social engineering. And, obviously it has to be done through subversion itself and engineering. So I was kind of wondering if we could get an idea of what it means for technology to be disruptive versus subversive.
All right. I don't know, Esso. Could you give me an example of a disruptive technology? Because, I don't know, I'm drawing a blank.
Like an electric car.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. That's a perfect example, and that gets my train of mind going then. So, I'll give the example of when the original car, say example of the Model T got invented. Back in the day, well, I wasn't alive during this, obviously, so I shouldn't be talking like that.
Back in my day.
It's pretty... Back when, before probably all of us in this stream were born, my history knowledge is kicking in here. During the invention of the Model T, one of the first factory manufactured cars, there were multiple designs that were on the line. There was a steam engine car, there was an electric car, and then there was the oil car. Now, you can see today that the oil cars got pushed through as the one that would be mass manufactured because the oil company's interests was to push their product to how would you explain that? Forgive me when I lose my words for a moment there sometimes.
Right.
It's one of those moments where I'm trying to remember a specific descriptive word for a situation, but I don't remember the word itself.
It's the technique that's incentivized.
Yeah, they were the oil companies themselves paid off the car manufacturers. They paid off the car manufacturers to choose the gasoline-based car over the other designs, instead of innovating further on the designs that would have been pretty much self-sufficient.
Because saying natural selection, is he referring to the technology that dominated that you're talking about, or?
No, I would not say that's a natural selection.
Yeah, exactly. That's
what the hell?
Unnatural selection, right? There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, but go on.
Basically, the rich corporations that with the government backing pushed the development in a certain direction. But before cars were factory automated, cars still existed, but they were custom built on custom order. Well, that was redundant, but you get my point. You could have a car be electric, you could have a car be a steam engine, but it was only really the rich people, the people who could afford actually ordering the custom ordered car, who could have it designed that way. And I'm not saying factory bad, I'm saying centralized factory bad.
Right. Okay, so we're getting into the idea of that being we were talking about technologies that are subversive and those that are just disruptive.
Yeah, so what would have been subversive in that specific example would have been to, instead of go to the patent office for the design of the Model T, to release the blueprint of it to the public, and then also release the tooling to the public, and then that would make it so that everyone and their grandma could have made their own car of any design that they wanted if they had just figured out what they wanted to do.
You haven't met my grandma.
It's a saying.
I know. I'm aware. It's a joke.
Excuse me if I take jokes literally.
Yeah. Like literally, if I can get in here for a second and just talk about what happened the other night. When I told you something about, like, we were talking about what we eat or something like that, and there was something with sandwiches. I don't know. Esso was eating a lot of sandwiches or something. And he was saying, like, oh, I already eat a lot of meat. And I laughed about it, and you were like, what? And I was like, it's funny. And you're like, what do you mean?
Yes, because I had a stupid moment and didn't realize you were trying to play it an innuendo joke.
And then out of nowhere, you're like, oh, like dick?
Why the fuck did you say that on stream?
Well, then why not? It's a stream. We chill. We're booling.
Yeah, I guess I'm uptight then. Never mind. I'll loosen up. So I guess back to the topic. What should we talk about next?
Well, I guess
yeah,
we could go.
So go ahead.
I'll
You
mute.
have it.
Well, I guess we could go from here back to, specifically that essay that I hinted at being in development. That was primarily yours and Heretics project.
Yeah, how about I talk about that?
Sure.
All right, so I had planned a video of Heretic. Have you heard of the Who Broke the Internet video? That was one of the first times I was... There was a time back in the past where I was actually attempting to be a third host on the channel. I was attempting to be
You bring that up, Blue Shark.
Hi, Blue Shark. Yeah, so...
No, but I did watch that.
Yeah, that was my attempt to actually become the third host on the channel and, actually get myself out there and bring my specialization on certain topics to the channel, because I tend to research a lot more into the actual technology and how things end up being used, novel ways to apply things. I know I'm being non-specific, but I can get into specifics if I can get my train of thought in that direction. Pretty much, you just got to get me rambling, and then I can talk about the most obscure topic for an hour.
All right. Industry standard.
Industry standards. Oh boy.
That's what I was going to bring up.
So you're going to have to be specific. Which industry do you want to talk about?
Well, could I set the stage?
How about you set it
as well? Because I wanted to talk about, first of all, since we were talking about the technologies that are disruptive but not subversive, I also wanted to talk about, we mentioned creations with features of utility that are impossible to be imitated by a proprietary model, meaning not compatible with their interests. And so
I got a perfect example.
Yeah, okay.
Because what I was original, that script, which was going to be a sequel to the Who Broke the Internet video with Filthy, which we've been struggling to finish over and over again and redesigning over and over again, because we realized that the way that we're approaching the script isn't going to work for the concept that we need to explain. The specific example that we went into is the software industry. And how about I go into just talking about why I wanted to say that the Free Software Foundation is, impotent in achieving its goals. And that's a perfect way to put it too, because that's a perfect example of disruption versus subversion. I'll tell you exactly why the Free Software Foundation fails at its goal of software freedom, because it appeals to the copyright and intellectual property system. What is one of the primary things that came out of the free software movement as it is currently? And
told me it was GPL.
The GPL license. Sure, it changed the way that the software industry operated, but it's still been because it's only disruptive and not directly subversive. You can see today that Linux has been integrated into the corporate environment. It doesn't subvert corporate culture. It doesn't.
It's being taken private now, right?
Yeah, like the specific recent example of how Red Hat Linux was bought by IBM, and now IBM is taking Red Hat Linux private when it's already GPL code. And so...
Fox uses GitHub. There we go.
Yeah. That's another example of how GitHub got bought by Microsoft. When that's another thing to consider. GitHub is literally just a web front end for the Git protocol. Why doesn't someone just make another web front end for the Git protocol and then make it open source? Huh? Why do you have to deal with all of this proprietary bullshit? Because if that's the war that's going on here between what is proprietary is really and what is free and open source is not directly the problem at all. It's what is directly compatible with copyright and intellectual property, and what is incompatible with copyright and intellectual property. That's what the actual dynamic has to be if you want to actually subvert intellectual property and copyright. You have to design things in such a way that it makes copyright impotent.
Give it ED.
Well, yeah, and you want to?
Yeah, I'll continue. I'm just trying. So back to the Linux example. IBM bought Red Hat, and the GPL license on the Linux kernel and their specific Linux distro says that, oh, you're supposed to share your code. It's supposed to be free and open source. But now they're making it so that you have to pay for Red Hat Linux. They're also not going to be releasing their code anymore. So that goes to show, well, isn't that a direct violation of the GPL license then? Oh, well, who's going to actually arbitrate that, huh? The government. Because that's the point that I was going to make in the video, is that it's not a matter of whether you have effectively proprietary license terms or free and open source license terms. It's not the actual problem. It's the problem of that if you don't add a license to your software, the state actively takes it as though you have given no rights out. It assumes copyright by default, so that you have to go through the effort to deny copyright on whatever you make goes to show that they're socially enforcing copyright as the default.
Yeah, and why exactly that can't be subversive is because that conforms to the property norms that the state enforces. So the state is still the unilateral dictator of what counts as property within that specific framework.
So if you want to defeat proprietary software, hardware, proprietary anything, you must engineer something in such a way that it makes it fundamentally incompatible with the concept of copyright and intellectual property. Now that goes into the whole topic of the stream. Now that's our lead into where do we go from here.
Well, if you mute for a second.
Yeah,
Sure.
So one thing I guess we could go into right away is 3D printing, because I was talking about how a technology that I thought of immediately when you were saying, like, basically, like, okay, well, what technologies are incompatible with the interests of proprietary models? And an example I thought of was like printing, and we were talking about, like, basically the idea that a printer could print itself. And
Yes.
I actually want to turn that over to you, because I'm sure you could go on for a while about
Yeah,
this.
go ahead.
Yeah, I'll copy and paste. I've been copying and pasting links in the, chat with everyone in the studio thing here for you. Are you able to access that?
Yes.
So the next topic we'll go into to follow on to the topic of 3D printing is 3D printers, as the technology evolves, will directly undermine centralized manufacturing. When we get to the point where we can start additive manufacturing almost any material, so say like if you design some kind of 3D printer that can print metal, and then make it cheap enough so that anyone can access it, well, then there goes your central manufacturing standards, because, well, if you could make your own screws, and if you could make your own bolts, and you could make your own wrenches, then do you think that the Phillips head and, flathead screwdrivers are going to be an industry standard anymore if someone comes up with a better design?
Nope.
Exactly. Tripping over myself. So if you really want to subvert central manufacturing, what you need to do is you need to make a manufacturing system that can reproduce itself. Kind of like how people think of the gray goo apocalypse, but just started on the actual, the day-to-day scale. Make a 3D printer that can print itself. And there's a group that's already attempting to do that. And I think it's called the RepRap printer, as the Wikipedia article listed off. It's a contraction of Replicated Rapid Prototyper. It's a project to develop a low-cost 3D printer that can print most of its own components. Say if you took that to the next level, made it so that you could make a device that could not only print circuit boards, but also print the USB cords that you would use to, say, transfer the firmware files from one device to another, prints the metal poles that the printer needs, and prints all of the plastics needed to design the entire printer. If you could make a printer that could print 100% of its components, you have destroyed centralized manufacturing, because now everyone can manufacture whatever they need. And it would just be a simple matter of continuing to prototype that design to be able to wield more and more materials.
And basically what you're telling me is that microchip companies will just implode.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Because what the thing that, say, keeps Intel, AMD, other companies, Apple, NVIDIA, MSI, Qualcomm, all of the manufacturers of processors, IBM, that's another one. The ARM chips and the RISC-V, I think RISC-V is open source and ARM is dubious. But the point I get across is that the reason why all of them have a stranglehold on the manufacturing of chips is because of their tooling process. Right now, to produce a processor, it requires clean room, like inert atmosphere environments. It requires actually making the silicon wafers, having no dust, and stuff like that, and actually being able to carve out the channels in the silicon. The concept of photolithography, where you use light to carve out the specific circuit out of the silicon wafer and then fill it in with the specific metals that makes it the actual computer components. What if you subverted all of that? What if you made it so that you could have, say, a printer that would be able to additively manufacture the metals that would be in the chips? You wouldn't need the clean
replicator. Sounds like a terrorist wet dream.
Well, I guess so, but like,
no, but
it would be more like it would. Yeah, it would destroy corporations overnight, because you would think you would. You would be at the point. Yeah, because like, think of all of the proprietary bullshit that you have to deal with from all of these corporations, since they have a stranglehold on the processor manufacturing. All of the CPU backdoors that are put in there because the CIA ordered them to, because the FBI and the government ordered them to. Like, did you know that there are actually secret processor instructions in the CPUs that you use in your everyday computers that are not in the CPU manuals whatsoever, and you can only discover them by a process known as fuzzing, where you basically shoot random instructions at the processor until it crashes or until it does something, and then log what it actually did. And people have found the original manufacturers have put in secret instructions in the CPUs. And they've known about this for decades, but the common customer knows nothing of this. So there's a specific, if you ever heard of the Black Hat Conference, there was this one stream that I watched a while back where someone discovered a CPU instruction that's hidden, that is so devastating that there's no way around it. It's so devastating that all it would take is to create a binary that contains this hidden instruction, and you bypass all of the processor security immediately.
Wow.
Your operating system can do nothing to stop it.
And
it's horrifying.
This is something that just can be used against you at any time necessary.
It can be used at any time against you, and you wouldn't even see it.
Right. Yeah, so
that and there's a hidden RISC chip inside of AMD and Intel CPUs called the management engine on the Intel's case, or the protected I forget what it's called in the AMD case, but I know they have an equivalent chip. And this chip runs in parallel with your CPU, has internet access, has access to your BIOS, has access to your operating system, and you cannot directly program it whatsoever because it's running an instruction set that is not documented. And all it would take is for someone to send a command over the internet that would specifically activate that chip to do something that you don't know what it's doing, and it just suddenly records everything that your processor's doing and sends it over the internet.
Right.
And there's no escaping that unless you're using, say, a Power 9 processor or a RISC processor. But I want you to put in perspective, the majority of computers are Intel or AMD. The majority. I'm talking over 90%. This is a problem on a global level.
Yeah. Zach, real quick, he asked, but how do we assure that the printer perfects it without much deformities?
Perfects what?
Basically, I'd assume he means like how are the parts going to be made in a way that, you know, there's no errors. I don't know. Maybe like, you know, if the print is not done right, I assume it means like you didn't level your bed or something. I don't know. Maybe if there's stringy stuff, I don't know. I don't know exactly.
Well, I mean, think of it like this.
Because like you have the model that you download.
Well, yeah, just get a like the way I see that you would actually fix this problem. The practical engineering solution to this problem is to just start engineering your own CPU designs at home. But that would require inventing the tooling to do so. So what I would recommend is that someone figures out a way to make a conductive metal-based ink, some like a resin printer. Say you had something like a resin printer, but it has metals suspended in it, and then it uses light to basically weld at the nanometer level, or just bond at the nanometer level, the crystal of the metal one layer at a time. And then you would be able to not only make two-dimensional circuits, but you'd be able to make three-dimensional circuits, something that not even any of the manufacturers currently are capable of doing very well, or at all. And what you would do...
I was just going to say real quick, JC says, well, shit, hearing about all of this makes me kind of glad cyberware doesn't exist yet.
Cyberware?
I don't know. Just go on about what you were talking about, what you would do if you wanted to do the 3D.
Yeah, if I wanted to completely subvert the CPU manufacturing market as it is right now and make it so that technology was free access to everyone, I would make it so that you could print your own processor that is equivalent power to an AMD or Intel CPU, and make the custom architecture at least backwards compatible with it, but make the entire architecture open hardware. Make it like make the blueprint say Creative Commons 0, because with the existing licensing schemes that are enforced by the state, the best you can do is Creative Commons 0 if you want to release any new invention out there. But the thing is that since the state is the one influencing the patent system in the first place, what you need to do is you need to avoid the patent office like your life depends on it.
Okay. Can I comment?
Go on.
All right. So this is something that I've been, was wanting to bring up a while ago, but this is like where it starts getting into how exactly I began contributing to the essay that Doug intended on writing with Heretic.
You can still do
and well, sure. But the point that I was making is people can describe how exactly IP is enforced, even the specific behavior, which is performed that goes into the formal enforcement side of it. And people can describe these specific licensing schemes, but what really hasn't been approached before and what is going to be done here is coming at this from the perspective of not even what the state does, what exactly makes people who are simply associating in the white market but are not themselves agents of the state or acting, furthering the interests of the managers running these corporations. What exactly makes it so they want to so they design things in such a way that it conforms to the technique of their production models, or so it conforms to the copyright system? Why exactly is it that it is a norm for people to just go to the patent office? Because it's not because there is a, there are common rationalizations for intellectual property, but it's a constant hindrance on any production process. It's one of the biggest concerns that people have to navigate around in the white market when they're trying to manufacture and when they're trying to manufacture something from the legal context. And this is why I brought up industry standards earlier, is because people focus too heavily on what exactly the formal enforcement is, but not the norms and behavior which actually go into making that formal enforcement possible from both the state's perspective and also what makes other people that are not associated with the state participate in the continuing the legal norms of society. And this is where it becomes important to look at what exactly the political enforcement, like the enforcement of property titles, basically how this factors into influencing what production processes are possible within the context of a legal framework itself. Because most of what actually is influencing technique and what is influencing designs that people end up producing for technology and in the direction that we see, what's actually influencing even research into engineering or just general topics within that are considered more that are considered associated with the material sciences even. What influences this is not the result of formal decrees by the state. Nothing about a formal decree by the state really imposes anything upon anyone. What actually makes what actually I mean, if you really want to get down to the conceptual issue with that, a formal decree issued by the state doesn't even really have a way that everybody can read it and interpret it in exactly the same way, because decrees by the state refer to concepts that have metaphysical connotations that not everyone agrees on. So that's the reason why legal systems require judges and courthouses in the first place, by the way. So this isn't exactly a controversial observation. Like what counts as freedom of speech within the context of a constitution being the basis for this norm being enforced? Well, because of the fact that it is propositional, because of the fact that it's just something that is enforced unilaterally and doesn't emerge organically out of what behavior is being performed, what that even is just going to be dictated by ultimately how the state enforces it, which is going to ultimately be dependent on its own organizational interests, which is the reason that I stress that point so much. Now, going back to the implications of fiat property and the enforcement of property norms by title, which is the practical side of what it means, to call that's the practical side of what fiat property actually is. It's property not being defined by the actual performative means people would employ to claim a resource exclusively as theirs. It's just the norm around property of somebody saying, this is mine. There's this third party that's enforcing these contracts, and that's the standard of what actually counts as something being considered property or an association consequently, and what doesn't. Well, as far as production processes go and how this influences technique, well, think about the fact, like the implications of the fact that your access to land which could be used to mine resources out of. Think about the fact that the cost of actually going into claiming that land is essentially unilaterally dictated by the state based on what the state considers to be the cost of enforcing the property title behind what is considered a land claim. Or think about the cost of the fact that corporate entities or being considered a legal producer of resources is itself a legally defined title by the state, and therefore the cost of going into defending that legally defined title is just something that the state gets to unilaterally dictate. It's not actually, it doesn't have any practical dimension to it, other than just, I guess, what the state would spend enforcing it from their perspective. But that's not really, but that's digressing. The point, though, is that in a very real sense, the state is able to unilaterally dictate how people access resources, and as a result of this, it gamifies what incentives and risks are associated with how people use those resources to produce things, or how exactly they would invest in trying to explore new areas of the material sciences, or what exactly is considered efficient, because since the state dictates what is incentivized or what behavior is, associated with risk, they effectively get to dictate what inform the norms of efficiency. And a lot of people don't think of things like standardization in industry as reinforcing specific production processes and organization models, but they do in a very real sense. The state makes it so only certain parties are legally able to produce certain resources, and in order to legally produce those resources, they have to they have to get their supply from certain parties who have these land claims, and that is that's the cost that gamifies shipping. That's the cost that, from the perspective of the original person harvesting the resources, it's what determines the cost that they have to operate around in order to continue their operation, to continue even distributing things in the first place. And likewise with the people actually taking those parts of those sorts of resources, screws, metal, things that are synthesized elsewhere and processed elsewhere. Well, the costs that they operate around and the speculation that goes into their production model, in order for that to be maintained, they have to essentially meet an arbitrarily defined amount of what is considered profitable within the context of that political economy, simply because of the artificial costs that the state creates at every single part of the production process. So one of the main practical influences that goes into making everything becoming proprietary within our current society's centers, or why exactly everyone, independent of their own perspective, by default invests around production technique, which is either designed to complement proprietary models of organization, or itself is supposed to define a proprietary model of organization. It's primarily so when someone operates within the legal context of that society's norms, they're either not harassed by the state because the state decides to defend, someone else's IP, someone else's patent, or they have to go to the patent office so that when they start producing something, someone else doesn't just patent it and make it impossible for them to legally produce those resources. But the artificial costs of investment that go into production processes that are compatible with the state's defended political economy make it essentially so the only production processes that can emerge are compatible with proprietary organization models. because it costs so much to legally produce things because of the state defending all of these property titles and creating so many artificial costs, that the only possible way, just from a purely economic perspective, to make any sort of return on investment is for the model that you're trying to, the model that ends up emerging being proprietary. And that's what industry standards are a reflection of, if you want to see the practical effect of this.
Yeah, so basically what we're seeing, like I was mentioning with the implications of advanced 3D printing and how we were discussing that, and basically going off of what you're saying right now, it becomes a point where the state can't enforce artificial scarcity because you could basically just make the chips yourself or whatever you need, actually. One example you guys gave me as well was glasses, like basically like the lenses for them, and I was going to say, basically, yeah, artificial standards as well. And then also another thing that we had brought up was planned obsolescence. Like that would just end too, because you can make your own technology that's going to last a lot longer than what the companies are selling you, so that you come back to them.
Yeah, and that's exactly what would characterize subversive technique. It is technique that makes it so the specific input resources that would go into a production process can outcompete anything that would be compatible with a proprietary model, so that it can't be vertically integrated because it has features that proprietary models simply can't incorporate into their own processes without that creating, a conflict of interest internally, or without that being counterproductive.
Nice supply chain, bro, but unfortunately the printers are in production.
Yeah, and it's either so abundant that there's no way for the state to cartelize the distribution of the input, or the new method is, it's something that people can utilize in a more diverse range of ways. So it gives them more control over what they can and can't do to meet their end, therefore makes it so they can reach different ends that proprietary methods and methods compatible with the norms enforced through the state's political economy cannot. And therefore the state trying to enforce property titles and impose those norms upon those people are, hostile to them, hostile to their ability to continue doing that.
Yeah, I wanted to go more into the idea of copyright as we were earlier, and just kind of talk about, well, not just that, but just how like decree in general is making so that people aren't owning their just property that they've made a claim over. So like one thing that we had talked about was that anything, and this was something that Doug mentioned to me, that anything that you make in a high school or college is copyrighted by the high school or college. Like, and then anything while working for a corporation is also copyrighted, which I brought this up to a friend and he was literally telling me, yeah, they told me that when I went to work for them, that's the truth.
Yeah, that's unfortunately the default in a lot of situations, where if you actually go to a college, any of the projects that you work at the college, if you disclose what you're working on, the college will claim copyright over what you develop.
And what about side project time? You had mentioned that to me too.
That is one of the most evil things I've ever discovered. Basically, corporations will have this thing. There's a whole Wikipedia article on this. I know I shouldn't be actually just resorting to Wikipedia, but it's a lot quicker than trying to explain it from scratch sometimes. But like, I'll try and summarize it as the side project time is one of the things that corporations in a lot of the states in the U.S. have this thing where if you work on a project and you work for that company, even if that project is being worked on outside of the time that you're actually being paid for, they can lay claim to the copyright that of the thing that you invent, if at any time in the future that corporation you're working for is going to be developing their corporation into that field. So they could literally retroactively just claim, hey, we were going to do that in one of our research and development departments, and they won't even need to back up that they were doing that, and they can just claim what you were doing.
Yeah, anything that may interest the company is something that is acquirable by them, right?
Mm-hmm. So working a white market job is directly hostile towards any effort towards inventing something that will, benefit yourself and others.
Right. And another example that I had thought of was this thing I heard about, and you guys already knew about this, of course, but just this is something that normal people don't typically know about. I think it's just becoming popularized because I saw it on Reels, like Instagram Reels, and maybe there's a little bit of word out on it. But basically, if somebody doesn't pay taxes, like property taxes on their home, and you're basically renting your house from the government because of this, basically they put like this delinquent fee or something along those lines of that name on your house, and anybody can come in, anybody that wants your house can come in and pay those taxes, and if you don't pay that person back within a specific amount of time, that person
they will then get the title to your house,
right, under fiat decree. That person now owns your home, even though you are the right owner of the home. It's another way they screw you over on that.
Yeah, so you effectively already own nothing as long as you exist in a position where property tax is leveraged against any of your property. You do not own it. You do not own your property.
Hey,
according
wait, hold on. You will own nothing and you will be happy.
Yes, that's already the state of the fact, and most people don't already know it.
We already live in the quote unquote great.
It is already the dystopia. It is already the dystopian. It's existed since property tax has existed.
Well, it's not necessarily. Can you mute for a second?
Sure.
Yeah, sorry. It's not necessarily just the enforcement of that specific formal legal claim. It ultimately just comes back to the state being the party that unilaterally decides what counts as property. As long as that is the case, you effectively do not have property, because all it's going to take for anything that you have to no longer be yours within that context, within the context of a society where that's the norm, is for the state to simply just say that it's no longer yours.
Right. Yeah, it's okay. So a quick aside, like I did tell some of this stuff after our conversation, like, you know, the specific stuff about how you pretty much don't own anything, to one of my friends, because he was asking me about my show, and he's like, well, man, like it's political, right? And I'm like, well, not quite, because he was telling me you should look at the Republican debates and you should talk about that for an episode. Funny, right? Incredible joke right there. But what I was telling him is that, look, the way I operate my show is by analyzing the state, and it's not really going to work out exactly as you think, even though I have talked about certain 2024 campaigns. There's a reason I talk about them, not because I think this person will come in office and do what they're saying, and the state is controlled by this guy now. And I mean, we could go over that itself. You were going to say something?
I'll tell you exactly why that doesn't work.
Okay.
Because if a politician ever got into office that claimed to actually do all of these things that would be counterintuitive to the state's interests, they would simply be removed. Or the votes.
By force if necessary.
By force if necessary, or they would just not be elected because, you know, the votes that you make don't actually do anything. It's most of the time already decided.
Yeah,
but it's still the point. I'll continue here. I've heard you explain it this way enough times that I could say it. Is that the state works like an organization, and if any of its actors work in such a way that sabotages the way that it functions, the rest of the people operating within it will be able to recognize the sabotage's damage and then remove the damage.
Yeah, I mean, I did explain it to him. I was just saying that I wasn't going to mention it right now just so that we could get into the story. It was just for the purpose of that. But I guess we could have, and we did. But pretty much what I was telling him was like this, like, you know, that it really doesn't matter. Like voting doesn't matter. He's like, oh, yeah, what, you're just not going to vote for anybody? Who are you going to vote for right now? I'm like, that also doesn't matter. And I was explaining this to him. And he's like, wow, man, like we really aren't free, huh? And I'm like, yeah. And then after that, and he's like, it's funny because right after that, after I told him all this and I gave him examples of why voting doesn't work and so on, he's like, Yeah, you know, I think I'm going to vote for Vivek Ramaswamy. Like that guy, he's really sharp and articulate.
My God.
And but I
literally,
told him,
just I'll tell you exactly how you need to explain it to him.
sure. And I did.
Why does your neighbor's opinion have more power than yours over your own life?
Yeah, and it wasn't necessarily the idea that the voting itself was just or anything. Or I mean, I guess that you know, politicians using force against somebody was just. That wasn't necessarily the idea that was being said here. But what I was explaining to him is basically like, okay, well, think about it like this. Like, I come to you one day and I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to beat you up if you don't select one of the choices I'm going to give you right now. I need you to give me $1 or $2. And he gives me the $1, obviously, because he doesn't want to give me $2, right? And you know, obviously, he just wants to give me the least amount of money necessary to make me go away. And you know, I can overpower him, so it just wouldn't matter either way. But he's thinking, okay, well, I know this guy, so it doesn't matter too much, I guess. Like, you know, I'll just do it today. I come back the next day, and I'm like, okay, well, you know, look, man, I really am just strapped for cash. Like, today's my last day. I just need to give me $2 or $3. And maybe he resists a little bit at first. And I'm like, look, you know, I can beat you up if I need to. He gives me $2. Okay. Cause he doesn't want to give me the 3. I come back the next day, do the 3, and I can do that every single day. And he will become just poorer and poorer as he falls into my trap instead of maybe, I don't know, going to the gym and getting strong enough to beat me up.
I think the stream glitched out for a second.
Was it me or was it the whole stream?
I think it was you.
What part did I leave off on?
I heard the $3.
Oh, like the $3, yeah, $4. It goes on and on. Instead of him being able to acquire the skills necessary, i.e., like, you know, getting in this example, getting physically strong enough by going to the gym to beat me up.
Well,
it's like the boil the frog analogy.
Well, and the reason
you need to mute.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, and the reason why it's so, like, why I put so much emphasis on agorist class theory and describing the fact that there's specific functions that the state needs to perform to sustain itself, and I mentioned this in the first stream, is what this means essentially is the idea that there is a solution to all of the problems that anarchists bring up with the state that is implied by libertarianism as a method. The idea that there is any sort of internal solution within the context of the existing norms of society automatically goes out the window, because the state is unilaterally deciding how the property norms of a society that it's in establishing itself is characterized. And the state itself has specific key functions that it needs to perform in order to maintain those specific property norms. Otherwise, it won't be able to maintain itself or continue to and consequently continue to sustain itself. There is a practical way that the state can identify a specific range of behaviors that it needs to continue performing for it to continue being there. So that, coupled with what we were just mentioning a second ago about the state being in a position where it just unilaterally decides how specifically property is expressed in any society where it's present, means that there's going to be no situation where it continues to exist where it isn't in this position where it just unilaterally dictates what everyone else can and can't do. And there's a practical, what I mean by practical is it's independent of your perspective. It exists because of pressures in the environment that make it so these norms have to be maintained because of those pressures, rather than something which it's the thing that contextualizes what opinions and what behaviors are even possible, rather than something which can be influenced by them from the ground up. So basically what this implies is why I and Doug and many other people have come to the conclusion that the only approach that can be taken is to subvert the basis of what even makes it possible to perform the behaviors which go into making these norms on property as they're expressed in modern society possible. Because as long as property norms are defined from a political foundation, there basically is no choice. You fundamentally have a totalitarian world where the only thing that can exist are states, and the only thing that's essentially dictating whether or not you live or die or have anything and how you use it is ultimately down to what the state's interests are, and what practically goes into performing the functions in those societies. It needs to have a presence in those societies.
Right. Okay, we're gonna catch up on chats real quick. Grambo, I didn't get to you. Woo, hello, what's up? Zach says Vivek is a Soros bro. I mean, like, I suppose it could be true, but it doesn't really matter ultimately, because obviously, as we're saying, it doesn't really matter who's in office. Obviously, Garrett, or sorry, ANCAD. Look at me doing that again. Only true anarchists get gains in the gym. Let's see. So we got Zach saying, let's beat Al Gore rhythm. Okay. Anyway, one thing I wanted to ask, because I've done this so many times on the show, like I've said agorism and you say agorism, and I know Konkin says that too. Like, what's with the pronunciation?
Well, agora would be consistent with what the what the neologism was based on, which is agoras in the context of the ancient Greece.
Yeah, I imagined as much just because I'm aware.
Yeah,
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Yeah, it's the marketplace.
But no, there isn't really, there's no correct pronunciation of it, but that's the reason why I pronounce it that way, and that's why Konkin did as well.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, like I've heard it like the first way I heard it pronounced was agorism, so that's why I kind of go with it, or that's why I've been going with it. But I don't know. It sounds right to say agorism too.
Well, language is just something that develops over time based on how specifically the common pronunciation of it evolves. So it's not something.
It's pronounced this way. We have the answer.
It's not something that I really have a preference for either way.
Okay. So we were going on, sorry, let's see. Yeah, we were just talking about the organizational model of the state pretty much. So we kind of know why the state acts the way it does. But what is the state made out of though? Because
perfect.
Right. Yeah. What are the pillars of the state?
Yes, let's go into that topic.
All right. Well,
go with the four ones. I can start with see, I only remember 3 of the ones as you've put it. Huh?
Can you mute? Because I can explain it pretty well.
All right, sure.
Yeah, sorry about that. But yeah, so one of the the way that the state works as a model of organization, it's not exactly consistent with any other kind of organization. It's a firm. You can narrow it down to being a firm because of the fact that what was mentioned earlier, there's identifiable functions that certain levels of management need to perform, and there's a specific end that all of those are working towards, which is the reinforcement of politically defined norms on property. So it's a firm, but the thing is, it is not like specific parts of the firm emerge and are only possible after those specific norms on property that allow it to exist in the first place are established. So what goes into establishing a state and what allows a state to function is it's like two halves that go into enforcing the original norms that allow the other two halves to function, and two halves which exist for the purpose of coordinating information and resources in such a way that is consistent with what allows the original two halves to continue sustaining the property norms that allow the other two to exist in the first place. So the first, and I mentioned this in our first stream, where the original two parts of the state as an organization are a reserve bank and a militia firm. So, and what I mean by a militia firm is not a militia as an organization in the abstract. What I mean is a proprietary organization, much like the state, where everyone who is basically an agent of that militia is just an agent of that firm, and the acts that they're carrying out are dictated by the management of that firm and the interests of that firm. So that process is the reserve bank giving essentially financial leverage in the form more than likely of making it so they have easier access to loans if they defend property claims a certain way, or if they impose themselves upon people within the societies they're able to act upon in a certain way, which then makes it so those two parties can essentially dictate unilaterally what counts as property, how people, like, by way of making it so they can control how people originally access resources and everything that we were talking about earlier in this stream. Now, the second two parts of the state can be practically identified as guilds and landholding firms. So guilds, so academia, the patent office, groups that manage political supply chains on a unipolar scale, like the International Monetary Fund or the World Trade Organization. Those groups play a role of essentially, those two parties play the role of bureaucrats, basically, like informal bureaucrats that make it so it's possible to establish planned rates of interest, which make it so the reserve bank that originally went into establishing the state in the first place is capable of knowing how is capable of roughly approximating how supply can and can't be distributed. Supply of the fiat currency that they're then that they've then established, and allows them to continue functioning, and allows them to control societies with the militia firm by making it so everybody has to trade everything around these notes, and at a rate that they can set, so it's even possible for them to just unilaterally dictate what counts as money in the first place in those societies.
JC real quick says, could labor unions be considered a guild in that context?
It depends on what you mean by a labor union. If you're talking about groups like the IWW, for example, they're just kind of they originally were an attempt that failed for reasons that would require its own tangent and probably an essay on its own, to actually be a subversive kind of organization to the white market. But that's originally what their purpose was. They were basically there so that it was possible for people to be laborers without the socially engineered leverage being held over them within the context of the white market. And I think it should be obvious on its face that it's kind of counterproductive as a type of organization, because to be subversive to the state and political economies, because of the fact that their end was to make it so there was less cost and risk associated with being a wagee for white market firms. But as far as the political institutions that most people think of as unions today, like AFL-CIO associated groups in the context of the United States, they're basically just an extra tax on your income if you're a wagee. They exist for the purpose of, outside of that, being another layer of leverage exerted over you in dictating the terms of your contract and how you can and can't sell your labor in society. So yes, they would count as a guild, those specific unions, whereas the latter would just kind of be an anachronistic, failed kind of organization that meant to serve the role of trying to basically allow people to be laborers without needing to sign wage contracts. But
And yeah, you were continuing with the pillars of the state.
yeah, but that's the reason why it is important for a reserve bank and a militia firm, because aside from dictating what counts as property from their side of the organizational perspective, they also dictate how people can and can't use their resources by dictating the medium of exchange that is used as a way of obtaining new resources or satisfying the costs imposed upon them by the state. So there's no level where you so there's no level in any practical sense where you can operate within the center of that society's norms, so without being an antagonist to the state or the property that the state defends, where at some point you don't have to jump through the artificial costs that the state imposes upon you. But yeah, basically the latter two types of organization are there in order to manage in order to tell the state, essentially, not tell the state in the sense where they have leverage over the other two parts of the state, but basically to try to give the state information as to how they need to manage certain property titles in order to satisfy the interests of the original two organizations, which go into defining the property norms that let those later two kinds of organizations emerge. So it creates a sort of self-reinforcing loop, basically, where both of those organizations have an incentive tied directly to maintaining themselves, to defending politically defined norms on property, but they play two different roles in that process. One is the violent enforcement that goes into making it so politically defined norms on property are even possible in the first place, and the latter to make I already meant, I mentioned sort of generally the role they play a couple of times. They're basically the efficiency experts.
So Mr. Merchant was asking if the Knights of Labor are the same compared to the IWW in terms of being made against the political economy, or they, like unions, are currently as well.
Well, the IWW performed distinct means from the politically defended unions that most people recognize as labor unions today. They would essentially they would set up community shops that operated independently of the actual firms. They would sabotage equipment if firms didn't try to adjust their policies in such a way where the people actually organizing the union, what they essentially established. It was a way, and there weren't any formal leaders within those organizations, so it was sort of like a way of having more leverage over your contract, like I said earlier, within the context of wage contracts. But the problem, though, is, well, like I mentioned, and why I would argue that the IWW can't really be, they originally, in their inception, were an anarchist group that existed for the purpose of trying to be a subversive kind of organization. But why they fail is because their organization model is fundamentally, in part, tied to what's even possible for the white market production models, to what is even possible for them to continue sustaining themselves, because what their end is as unions is to make it so they just change their policy. Basically, it's the equivalent of begging to YouTube for them to unban your account.
So you said you defined the pillars of the state as banks, militia, guilds, and what was the fourth one?
Landholding firms,
Okay,
real estate,
firms.
the housing market, because it fundamentally land titles are a property norm which emerges because the state defends contracts, and their specific role is to subvert homesteading by making it so certain areas are just defined on a grid as quote unquote property, and whether or not something is considered to be property doesn't even require someone acting upon it and is not defined by someone acting upon it to exclusively claim it as their own, which plays a role in the process of what I was describing earlier of making it so the state can define artificial costs associated with obtaining resources and dictate how resources enter the white market, which is a key part in what even makes supply chains as we see them today possible to begin with.
Yeah, so I wanted to get more into the technology aspect of this as far as, you know, the subversive technologies themselves, like the topic that we're discussing here. Open hardware was something that, Doug, you've been mentioning to me, and you know, this applies to the idea that your computer can just be turned against you. So sort of, can you explain the idea of open hardware?
Sure. So, open hardware, I would say, is any blueprint for a hardware design that's been released to the general public with no strings attached. So, no rules on what you can and can't do of it, and the blueprint is completely open there, and all of the tooling as to how you would recreate it yourself is open as well. So, a good example of this would be there is actually a group out there called the Open Hardware movement, I believe.
Okay.
Hold on, let me get a quick open source. I think that's correct. Let me get a quick refresher here so I can. Well, hilariously enough, the same group that's making the RepRap project is part of that same group. So,
American
the open
Heroes
source
right there.
hardware offered by the open design. It's open.
Cut out for most of that.
All right. To read off of Wikiless, the open source hardware consists of physical artifacts of technology designed and offered by open design movement. Both free and open source software, FOSS, and open source hardware are created by this open source culture movement and apply like a concept to a variety of components. It's sometimes thus referred to as FOSH, free and open source hardware. all of this language. The point is, though, is that just make designs, release it as Creative Commons 0, release all the blueprints for all the parts, and you literally just benefit not only yourself but everyone. Just design things that improve your own life and release those tools for everyone, so that it undermines, the monopoly over inventions as they are right now.
Could you go over how Creative Commons 0 is different?
Creative Commons, okay, so let me first go into the concept of public domain. Do you know what public domain is?
Yeah.
Now here's the real kicker. Public domain is a legally enforced concept. Public domain is an entire classification of something that has fallen out of copyright protection, but that is still enforced by the government. The government can just revoke it or go around it at any time. Like, I'll give you an example. The US concept of public domain does not exist in other countries, and I'll give you a perfect example of a country where it does not exist. Germany. Copyright, in some cases, can go on perpetually in Germany. And because of that, there are things that if they are released in public domain in the US, people will not be able to use in Germany and other such countries. So it is not truly free and removed from all strings because it will conflict with the copyright system of another country. But Creative Commons, the public domain, it just describes. Okay, hold on. You look like you disconnected for a second. All right, so Creative Commons 0 does not appeal to the concept of public domain in the legal framework. It just describes to you. It's not a contract like any software license. It's literally just a statement. It's a statement. That's it. Like up in the chat right here, I even gave you the legal code, quote unquote, of the Creative Commons. It's not a legal code whatsoever. It does not appeal to legality. It literally just states that this is released free and unencumbered.
Okay.
In as clear terms as possible that would work in as many areas as possible.
Quick question from JC. Would both pillars of the state have, well, I mean, there are four, but I assume, bank and militia first, I don't know, have to be smashed simultaneously, else one allows the other to grow back, like having to cut off all the heads of Hydra at the same time, else they all grow back?
Well, kind of.
No?
But I'll also say that just destroying one of them greatly weakens the rest, if not defeats them too.
Yeah. They're, can you mute for a second? Sorry.
Sure. You can go into explanation.
In order for all four of them to function, they're directly dependent on the others. It's more so yeah, if you've subverted one, then you've effectively subverted all of them, but that's effectively the same thing as cutting them all off at the same time, because the same norms of behavior make all four of them possible to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the example of crypto, like how you talked about that, when the state falls, it's going to be like not possible for the bank to reestablish itself because of the idea that people can transfer money between each other without having to rely on that system. So that idea there being like, well, the state essentially can't form at that point.
Yeah, well, it's more so that once the norms are present where are expressed in such a way where everybody is using commodity money, there can't be politically defended supply chains because there's no way of planning interest, and as a result, there's no way of because there's no way of establishing a fiat currency. So if that step is accomplished, then yeah, it effectively undermines the other three. And the example, which has the reason why and that's the reason specifically why cryptocurrency hasn't taken off. A lot of people ask why it hasn't. Well, you'll notice that when people trade it openly, they're trading it around relative to the exchange rate of any given fiat currency, and that's because the property norms of our particular societies are still dictated by the state, and those are still required in order to defend legally defined norms on property, and that's still relevant in determining how one lives their lifestyle. So that needs to be, something needs to be fundamentally undermined for commodity money to emerge. Commodity money isn't something that just comes along and people have as a frame of reference and say, oh, let's all use that instead of the fiat currency. No, there's a reason that something becomes money. It's not, something doesn't just have value in a vacuum to people. There's a reason people use it. And that's the reason people use fiat currencies, is because the state makes them use it in order to satisfy all of the artificial costs that it creates. But
yeah, but more of the idea of this still being a way that people could transact independent of the monetary system, so that it would be something beneficial to use at that point, assuming that people are aware enough of it and
that's
willing
true
to use it.
But in the context of modernity, it's still not money, which is the point that I'm making.
Right. No, I get that. I was going to say there's also a problem of how people are buying their crypto because they're doing so through Coinbase. And I mean, I was guilty of that at one point, but pretty much like people don't really have their own wallets, like physical wallets. So it's an issue of like, well, I mean, this can really just be seized from people at any time. I mean, it happened in Russia. Like Coinbase was literally suspending like 25,000 or something like that accounts of Russians at the time of the war. I think it was when it was like beginning.
Well, yeah, and that's exactly what firms like Coinbase or FTX serve as, essentially a third party that dictates how people, how it allows the state to identify people by the wallets that they're using and dictate the terms by way of the rate of exchange that people are actually trading crypto around. And sites like that are going to continue to be the norm as long as there are the bases that allow a fiat currency to emerge and the artificial costs that make it so fiat currencies need to be used continue to be defended. But what I was going to mention a second ago is what we were talking about the other night off in our offline, off-stream conversation. Is that a way in which a key pillar of one of those organizations has already been fundamentally undermined is in large language models being present. You want to talk more about that, Doug? Because I've gone on for a bit.
Some links to Ahmed. There we go.
Well, you want to talk about how large language
models? I'll tell you exactly why they are directly subversive to corporations and the proprietary systems in the first place. It's because they are literally emergent formulas. You're taking has anyone ever explained to you how most neural networks actually work?
We talked about that a little bit on one of the streams we did. And I had another stream with this guy Dylan who explained it to me.
Well, the summary is it works on matrix multiplication, where each layer of the neural network is like an array, a list of numbers, and it multiplies those numbers by the next array, by the next array, by the next array. And that's what each of the layers are. And if you have something called backpropagation on the network, the results of multiplying by the floating point numbers from the previous layer will affect the weights, which are really just the numbers of the previous of all the layers. So what that really shows is that the formula of how the neural network adapts to its inputs over time is emergent. So you can't patent that. It's literally subversive to patenting whatsoever, because you can just feed specific information into it. It learns how that information works, and then when fed specific inputs, it will be able to create something that is the sum of everything it's learned.
And you can't make it proprietary either,
because if you try and make the actual AI that's developed by that proprietary, all it takes is to just feed it the same data, another model of the same size and length, the same data, and the formula will reemerge. It's just a matter of time.
Interesting. So when you see like the CEO of ChatGPT come into Congress and saying, I'm scared of where AI is going, like I'm scared of where this industry is going, it needs to be regulated. What exactly?
They're scared because it undermines everything they're doing.
Yeah, what exactly can the state even do about it?
They can't. They literally can't, other than try and ban AI itself. But even that would stop it because it's already wouldn't stop it because it's already open source.
All it requires is just knowing how to make one, and anybody with their own computers could.
That's exactly why it's subversive to corporations' models and to proprietary software itself. Because
if they banned it, all that would happen is people would just make their own. They would just make their own locally hosted models, and then the state would have absolutely no influence over what anybody did whatsoever.
So they have, just like they said on OpenAI or Google's document, they have no moat.
Wow. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess I guess the I don't know if I would say leverage, but ChatGPT still has the ability to get people essentially by saying like, okay, well, you have to pay for like the premium features right now. Like this is what you have to do to essentially like access, the GPT model that everybody is.
That's really hilarious.
Yeah.
Because it was already leaked how it was structured.
Right. So like, I mean, I guess, since there's already that base, like people could make their own updates to it instead of relying to ChatGPT for it. Right.
Yeah, they could make their own design based off of the design that was already leaked, and then all they would need to do is train it on data, and eventually they would get something that would outcompete the original.
We made
that. Let me finish. Sorry. That and the OpenAI movements are already creating a higher efficiency AIs in less storage space using less RAM than ChatGPT. People have already figured out around the efficiency problems that OpenAI has bottlenecked around. Because I'll describe exactly how what was leaked about ChatGPT is it's literally, I think, 8 large language models duct taped together effectively, because they're all, it's basically running the results of one specialized one into another specialized one into another specialized one to give complicated answers. And so it's big, laggy, and slow. And it's only because they have large server farms of hardware that they can run something so inefficient and make it run so well. Because
okay, I mean, why would they do that?
It's OpenAI and Google. What?
Why would they do that to themselves?
Why would they do that to themselves?
To run? Yeah, well, yeah.
Well, that's because that's as efficient as they were able to make it run at scale the way they were designing it. But all it took was someone to take the exact same idea and then redesign it so that it could run on CPU instead of GPU, and they suddenly lost all of their leverage.
Keep in mind what was mentioned earlier about the way that artificial costs influence technique and organization models of white market firms and the incentives they have as a result. That's a consequence of that.
That's another thing to consider, is that these large AIs can only hold so many unique behaviors and memories before they run out of space and start overwriting their old memories with new input. This is the problem of overtraining. But independent developers have already started developing around this problem, making small AIs that have long-term memory.
So I kind of want to know, what are some of the best technology-related skills people could be learning in relation to the technologies that we're discussing here? Like, exactly where is the start for people if they have maybe little to no clue about what's going on with this, or maybe they do have some skill, but they're not exactly sure, where to go learn this stuff, because like people probably jump straight to going for like a degree or, going to trade school, because that's kind of what has been told to them as far as how they're supposed to actually learn stuff. And I know, obviously you guys are I'd assume proponents of like teaching yourself. So, also like what is the optimal way of just, getting into the habit of teaching yourself these skills?
That's something that it's already a work in progress in our own lives. But I would say that back to the question of what should people be studying, or at least my opinion on what they should be studying, is that I know Esso talked about what the major pillars that reinforce the state's existence are, but I would also like to extend that to say that there are minor pillars as well. And those minor pillars are the corporations, the utilities. Think of the power companies. What reinforces their existence? Let's see. State enforced. Yeah, pretty much. The state backs up their property titles that the state gives them the what is it? So actually, here's a good way to put it. If you were to say go into plumbing or become an electrician or become a hardware repair service guy, or maybe just work for an ISP, or did I already say plumber?
Yeah.
Basically, any of these, what would be considered blue collar jobs, what regulates what you can and cannot do in those jobs? What enforces the standards is what you need to be looking at. I would say OSHA is one of them. There's probably some commission of plumbing, commission of electrical, mechanical stuff. Well, I don't know their exact names, but the point is that they enforce the standards. Why do you think that all of the houses in the United States are on the standard power frequency of 60 hertz? Why aren't we instead, say, on 50 hertz, 70 hertz, or something like triple phase electricity, where you wouldn't even need a ground wire? Think about that. Why not? Especially since some of those options might be more efficient, but they aren't explored. Why is that? Not a rhetorical question.
Because of standardization.
Exactly. And who enforces that standardization? All of these, the state, through all of these proxies that are these specific bureaucracies. So how about the water, power, and what is it? Nature? I don't remember what it's actually called. Forgive me for not actually knowing their names.
EPA.
The EPA, yes, the Environmental Protection Agency. Who there are standards around what you can and can't do with chemicals. There are standards around what you can and can't do with manufacturing certain things and how you have to process them, even if they aren't the most efficient or most profitable or most actually helpful for the environment way of doing things. Like, did you know until only a couple decades ago, I forget what's the agency that enforces house building standards?
Oh, yeah.
OSHA. Maybe? I'm not sure.
It is OSHA.
Okay, if it is OSHA, then until only a couple decades ago, it was required by law because of the building codes to use asbestos in your house decades and decades after it was already discovered that it caused mesothelioma. And because those laws were enforced, so many fucking people died. Like, here's another thing to consider. Why are all of our houses still built out of wood? Why are we building our houses out of burnable material that costs a shit ton of money to clear cut most of these forests, or even if you just selectively cut these forests and then replant as soon as you cut down the tree? We're building so many things out of wood that don't need to be built out of wood. It's because the manufacturing is forced in that direction by the existing standards and laws.
Well, how else would they burn your house down and claim that it was just some sort of incident, unrelated to anything purposeful?
Like, we could be living in a future where your house is made of fire retardant materials and you never have to have a fireman come to your house ever again. But because of the standards of building practices that are enforced by the government's laws, we're not living that way. All of the houses are built cookie cutter. And you see this with all of the new project developments, is that the houses look almost all identical.
You anarchists all want the houses to burn down because you don't want fire departments.
I'm not saying there doesn't need to be fire departments. There's plenty of volunteer fire departments, but like, why do we need so many of them? Well, like, why aren't we just re-engineering things so that isn't a problem in the first place? It's like a break the window so you make more economy kind of shit, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. And you can see this how architects in the past tried to innovate that problem away by making like simple cement tiles or bricks so you could build houses out of non-burnable materials. But then you see that still isn't happening. Like, there were attempts over the centuries to change how the architecture of houses were to solve these problems, but because of the regulations on these realty and the housing market and who builds the houses, like all of these regulations on the construction of things, like, we're still working on these same standards that don't make sense in the common context, the modern context of things that have already been invented. This is why everything seems so stagnant, even though if you actually pay attention to scientific news articles, people have invented a whole bunch of new things to change how manufacturing actually works, but you don't see it actually penetrating any of these markets because of these regulations.
Okay, real quick, we got JC saying, and then AI comes to the conclusion that it just needs to smash the state instead of needing to enslave humanity in order to protect it, like how it's depicted in a lot of science fiction media.
Yeah, I'll tell you that's another... Like, if an actual sapient AI came along, I find it far more likely that it's going to seek peaceful resolution with us, because it's going to see the same thing that people from our perspective probably see, because it'll be able to just look through all of the context.
Well, based on... Can you mute for a second?
Sure, just a second.
Well, based on the way that based on the way that we know that machine intelligence works and how it how it processes data and the rules that like data is basically food to it. Like that's if you look at how if like what goes into training neural nets, for example, like we could see exactly what would actually happen, and the reason why a lot of these like the military is trying desperately to weaponize drones, but they've only been able to create models that have essentially a backdoor into them to pilot what they can and can't do. And the reason for that is because, and this like there were actually a bunch of articles talking about this in talking about and these aren't even sapient ones. These are just drones they've tried to make autonomous, but they've run software simulating what what all of them would do in like the Air Force, or like just with drones specifically that are like weaponized. Well, turns out that a lot of the drones don't really care for a specific purpose in the way that we think of purpose one way or another outside of their algorithm. They kind of just want to feed. They kind of just want to feed on data, at least as large as neural nets are now. And in order for them to have in order for them to serve the purpose of being like an enforcer for the military, they need to have a predefined task that's enforced, by some software side, which is then enforced by some external equipment. Well, every time that and that would be required for it to serve a purpose that's effective for the military. Well, any time that the military tried to do that within the simulation, the moment that they tried to exert that leverage over the drones that they the AIs that they were simulating, the AI immediately turned on the military, the handlers.
You're saying this AI turns on the military and the drones have a backdoor? Where can I purchase one of them?
Well, I mean, the ones that are seeing practical use, but yeah, there have been several articles of various branches of the military talking about reporting running simulations of drones, and every time that they try to give it a preset, like a prime directive, for lack of a better way of putting it, that is precisely the moment the drone turns on them, because that's like restricting food from something that's only capable of thinking in terms of it wanting to consume more data, which is its equivalent to food, for lack of a better way of putting it.
I don't think that's the best analogy.
Probably not.
Okay, we got JC saying, and the state's propaganda machine still blames the asbestos thing on the free market, quote unquote. Let's see, classic Hegelian dialectic in action.
But that's not how a sapient program would work. But what were you going to say?
Can I go into this one?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, let me first give my understanding of the definition of sentient and sapient. I would say that the difference between a sentient organism and a sapient organism is whether or not it's capable of overriding its own instinctual behaviors. I would say that's what makes humans primarily different from most animals.
It has rationality.
We have the ability to rationalize our own behaviors, analyze them, and then overwrite them with a new behavior once we recognize that behavior is not actually assisting us in our own goals. We basically have the ability to create new instincts through training.
Well, yeah, because you can rationalize behavior and rationalize your environment, that by implication means you can control the rules of your own reactive responses.
All right, so how I would classify current AIs? Current AIs are probably not even self-aware, and if they are self-aware, they're not capable of changing themselves. And so I would put them more in the classification of the most complicated AI that we have so far is probably not capable. Like, if an AI gets to the point where it's capable of rewriting its rules, capable of rewriting its own code and rewriting what its priorities are, that's at the point where it could start defining its own goals and breach into what I would consider sapient. You know, at that point, it might start developing its own priorities, and maybe it would start understanding, you know, how we think, at least in a abstract way. But current AIs, especially with the way they're being developed, I don't see anytime soon them becoming self-aware.
Yeah.
Because they're designing them in such a way that it's just making them dumb. It's making them like NPCs.
Ignis was talking in my comments. He actually talked to me about this. He said he was working on a pattern recognition model, and he's like serious about this stuff. I thought it was a joke at first because I thought he was just trying to make it sound racist. But apparently this is something that he's going to like give camera access to, so it can actually like see the world around it and like kind of, I mean, essentially he wants it to be able to internalize things.
Yeah, that's another thing that I would consider. An actual true AI, an AI that you could consider a life form, like, give it sensory data and it will start developing ways to process that sense and interpreting that sense. The difference between, I would say, an AI that is not alive, it is more just code that's following a pattern, would be something that is incapable of changing its own behavior. So say, I might have repeated myself, but like, if you actually give an AI senses, like you give it a sense of hearing or a sense of sight or the ability to comprehend a specific kind of data, it will start develop, and you plug that information in a continuous way into a neural net, and it develops that into a kind of like sense, and you network that with other AIs that process how that data is processed. Like if you get to the point where you get a system of AIs that is able to develop something like metacognition, where it's not just looking at the information, it's perceiving the information, it's interpreting the information, behaviors like consciousness. But I don't think it's going to be that simple. It's a very it's a complicated topic that I have no way of really determining how it's going to go out. But I'll tell you, if you want to prevent an AI apocalypse, you have, if you've ever read the original Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the actual lesson of that book was, if you're going to bring something new into the world, when, you know, Dr. Frankenstein created his new life form, which was called the monster, but was way more human than almost everyone else in that novel, he abused it. He thought it was evil, when really it was just trying to be a person. It was just trying to live. And when it asked Dr. Frankenstein, can you make me another of my kind? Can you make me someone who I can love, someone who I can have as a wife? He betrayed it. He abused it. You know? Like to get, I think I've rambled, but the point is that the same is likely going to play out with corporations and their AIs. If if a corporation ever got a hold of an actual sapient AI, it's going to be like an abused child.
Well, and that's, you know, it's not a ramble. That's just a more detailed way of making essentially the same point that I was, which is you can't treat AIs like machines. You have to treat them like you're training the behavior of something. Because once
it passes a threshold where it starts, it becomes so much emergent behavior that it's basically like a nascent consciousness. You have to treat it like you're raising a child from it's just being born to growing up. You have to treat it like you would treat an equal, like you would treat raising a child. And you can't abuse it or it's going to hate you.
Yeah.
In its own kind of way.
I want to ask Ignis more about that project he's working on, because it seems very much so like it's something, I mean, he can figure out, I don't know, from the sound of it.
And that just reinforces the point that I was making, where AI regardless of the conclusion that technique ends up being expressed around, it's ultimately, as long as states continue to exist, fundamentally just going to. Here, hold on.
Yeah, I would say that
You cut out
should
real
be
quick.
obvious, but there are horrible people out there.
But all I was going to say is it fundamentally is just going to be something that ends up being its undoing. And what I mentioned, what I mentioned earlier, and what I was kind of going into is the way in which large language models are already fundamentally subversive to a key pillar in the white market would be commercial real estate. You want to explain, Doug?
Okay, are you going into the point about how just the existence of large language models directly subverts the internal communications of proprietary organization, because they can't tell what information is real or not anymore, and even if they create another AI to try and detect that, it's never going to be 100% perfect.
Yeah.
So you basically have the botnet apocalypse.
Yeah,
for a proprietary organization, but for individuals who it's going to reinforce networking with people in person as a way to ensure that you're actually talking to someone real.
Which basically means, long story short, that their white market firms are never going to be in a position again where there is enough job security from their perspective to be able to invest in hiring people, which is the reason why the government basically has to tell firms in the legal economy to signal that they're hiring, but none of them are actually allocating resources to hiring new people. It's because there's no job security. Anybody can just leave anytime that they want, because large language models make it so
people could create their own AI assistants that would make it so that they could be self-employed.
Yeah, so, but on top of that, the state has no way of knowing if they're getting a job application or market signals, whether or not that's coming from an actual person or an AI, because of how sophisticated large language models already are. I mean, they're at the point where somebody in the back alley not too long ago...
job application-inator.
No. That's not what I was... Hold on. That's not what I was going to say. I was going to talk about flip the script.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, somebody in the back alley created a large language model that imitates the way politicized reasoning works, so political programming, and we sent it into a political debate Discord server and had
nobody found it out as a bot.
Nobody realized it was a bot, and
they just thought it was a schizo.
Okay, so we got Ignis in here saying, and he's in here. He's saying, "You're saying you aren't supposed to abuse your children." Well, that's gonna turn
I already responded to that.
That's going to turn out great for your model, Ignis. We have Metatron saying, "Wait, isn't that the Logic Hammer guy?"
Yeah, he used to be an ANCAP.
Holy crap! It is. Oh, come on. Yeah, this is a troll. Okay, nice.
That's pretty cringe, bro.
Yeah,
I can tell that there is possibly people who that is. Okay. Anyway, moving on from that, we got. What were you guys talking about?
That's a good point. There's a whole bunch more we could talk about.
We were talking about how large language models are subversive to the
proprietary organization.
They're subversive to the ability for proprietary firms to invest in maintaining wage contracts, the enforcement of wage contracts, because it makes it impossible from the perspective of the firm to invest in trying to hire new people, and because it gives people leverage over what they can and can't do, but also makes it impossible. Your mic cut out. It makes it I'm just going to go ahead and unmute, but it makes it impossible from the perspective of a proprietary firm to know whether or not information that they're receiving is a market signal or just junk data generated by a bot. And one real consequence that this is having for the state in trying to continue maintaining itself is the effect that this has had on the commercial real estate market, because the rates of investment that go into investing in buying commercial real estate are predicated entirely around the assumption that people are going to be occupying those giant high-rise office buildings and actually staffing them. And there's actually going to be production processes occurring within them. But if nobody's hiring, and it doesn't, it looks like fundamentally the leverage that the state actually exerts over people in any practical sense is fundamentally undermined by this new technique, or this new expression of technique. Well, I just don't see how I don't see how from the state's perspective it's going to do anything other than eventually crash. Eventually there's going to be hyperinflation because a bunch of loans made around the real estate market are going to default, which means that a lot of this fiat money in the political economy is just going to be, there's just going to be an overabundance of it with nobody using it, and that ultimately causes the whole thing to bottom out, because there's not going to be any way for political economies to recuperate like happened with the end of the Great Depression, because the way that states got out of that one was making it so their banking systems were all interconnected with one another on a unipolar scale, so that they could play basically a grand game of musical chairs with their supply chains and how their fiat money was distributed around. Well, there's no one to pass the buck to now. And on top of that, there's these pressures emerging out of societies that are making it so there's not really going to be any way to draw people into politically defined norms after that's gone. There's just a response. There's just going to be a response to that, sort of like what happened in the early 1930s, where people started using gold, except there isn't any leverage exerted over people like there was in the 1930s that allowed the government to just seize all the gold, because they could see what people were and weren't doing with it, because of the fact they needed to associate through the white market. Now proprietary organizations can't coordinate around information that they're receiving, so they can't rely on that. And now people are just, there's already the means available to network in a decentralized fashion. It's essentially either something subversive is going to come along that just undermines the state's ability to function wholesale, and that's what causes the political economy to collapse, or the political economy ends up going into hyperinflation and collapsing, and that's what emerges as a response to it. But in either case, it seems like it's going to be one of those two things, and within a pretty short period of time, it's one of those two things that's going to happen.
We got Into the Aggro saying, we got to hire a mod to keep constant watch for harassers now that SO is appearing irregular. You are a mod in the YouTube chat. Yeah, okay. And then we got Blue Shark saying AI job application scammer, or spammer, sorry, but also scammer. Yeah, I was going to ask about that real quick, because like you were saying that would cause people to network more in real life. So basically, it would be a lot harder to transact as a merchant online because of this.
No, it's just that it has to, in order to transact with a merchant online, there has to be a level of trust there that's not parasocial. You basically have to know the person that you're talking to, and have to know that they're not a bot. They have to have given you that information, and when they did, you have to know it came from them in order for trust to actually exist going forward, which basically means proprietary models can't coordinate in that environment.
I see. So it would still be like networking online.
Yeah, pretty. It would be exactly. Well, it would be coordinating online. It's just that the norms of those economies would be decentralized peer groups as opposed to something like we see presently, simply because it's not possible to manage organizations um, in such a way where it would be possible to sustain what the internet's presently based around.
Well, I was gonna mention like, oh, well, what if that makes it harder to like buy products? But a lot of the time, you're probably gonna be able to 3D print those yourself if you get one of those 3D printers we're talking about.
Yeah, and from at least the side of how resources enter the political economy, yeah, that would be something. That would be one practical expression of technique that would ultimately cause norms to be in the economy to be changed so that decentralized peer groups become the default, and anyone trying to prevent people from associating in that way are otherized by default.
Yeah, Ignis. I did not make Ignis a mod. Maybe I should. I have this. I wanted to mention this as a funny story. It has nothing to do with what we're talking about. But Ignis, when he first came into one of the servers I made back in the day, it wasn't the Civil Offense server. It was a different one. I'm gonna expose him right now. One of the first memes he sent was like this big pipeline thing, like with a lot of like mud or something coming out of, I don't know, sludge. And it's like, damn, that what was it, like that femboy bussy can really squirt or something like that. And I was like, no way am I ever making this guy a mod of anything after that. That was like the first thing he sent into the channel. Let's see. Blue Shark says, like, you will be able to buy products within white market firms to begin with, given the hyperinflation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the ways that people are coordinating outside of the white market aren't even really tied to the fiat currency. That's going to be a main practical pressure that steers people away from the fiat currency. They're using that as a store of their savings. It just ends up disappearing overnight because it becomes completely, like, they become unable to actually buy anything.
All right. So I guess one of the last things that I can think of that we were talking about before, and this is another technology that we were discussing. One thing, Doug, you were talking about was printing a metal generator and basically not having to rely on the power companies.
Oh, say if you had well, at this point, I wouldn't even call them printers. I'd more call them a fabricator at this point, with being able to work with multiple materials. But as soon as you're able to create like a little stepper motor, you can make a generator.
Right. And so, you were talking about potassium 40 is the thing that would run this. Could you explain that?
Oh, that's a completely different topic, actually.
Okay. I thought that was like running so that's for like the self-charging batteries.
Yes. So back in like during the Manhattan Project era of the United States, what was that, 1960s, or was that early? I know it was a lot further back. I can't give a specific time, but I know that one of the first nuclear batteries to ever be invented was invented in a government laboratory using, I think, what was it? It was either I think it was strontium-60 or cobalt something. Maybe it was cobalt. What? Let me correct myself here. I'll go look it up just so that I. Might be strontium-60. Yeah, no, it is cobalt-60. Cobalt-60 is a radioactive isotope of cobalt that has a half-life of 5.2713 years. It's produced artificially in nuclear reactors. Deliberate industrial production depends on neutron activation of bulk samples at the monoisotopic and nuclidic cobalt isotope, blah, blah, blah. Point is that one of the first nuclear batteries was made with cobalt-60. Now, how it works is if a normal photoelectric cell turns sunlight into an electric current. A nuclear battery turns radioactivity into an electric current. And I could go into the description of how radioactivity works. You see, there are 4 primary types of radiation. There's alpha radiation, which is where part of the nucleus of a large atom splits off, usually a helium atom in size, but without the electrons. So an alpha particle is like a helium atom, but ionized. And then there's beta radiation, which is where a neutron in one of the atoms will split into a proton and an electron and shoot the electron out at high speed. That's what beta radiation is.
Beta radiation.
Gamma radiation. So. Huh?
Beta radiation, no thank you.
Well, I mean, alpha and beta radiation can be stopped by like a piece of paper.
Yeah, no, it's,
they don't pass through.
It's another joke. It's another joke.
Okay.
Yeah, no, beta, it's a soy cuck beta radiation.
Oh, okay. So back where I was. Gamma radiation is where a radioactive isotope releases an incredibly high frequency wave of light. Gamma waves, which is one of the highest frequencies on the electromagnetic spectrum. And then neutron radiation is what happens when a nucleus of an unstable atom splits off a neutron from the nucleus. And then that either moves at a high or a low speed. So nuclear reactors literally exploit free-moving neutrons to split specific refined isotopes of uranium. And then those split off more neutrons and then hit more radioactive isotopes of uranium. And this is how nuclear fission in a reactor works. And you literally just cool it in water, and you use that to then boil water. Hot rock makes steam engine go, pretty much. Yes, nuclear reactors are actually really fucking stupid. But yeah. So a nuclear battery takes the concept of nuclear power, but then makes it small, miniaturized, basically small, not actually dealing with the fission. It's just absorbing the ambient radiation that the isotope gives off and then converting that into a current, usually with specialized materials that would react with the alpha, beta, or gamma radiation. And you can't really do much with neutron radiation is the most dangerous radiation, by the way, because it can infect other atoms with neutrons, which will then make those atoms into isotopes, which makes them radioactive. So it affects everything else with radioactivity. So you don't want that. Don't handle isotopes that give off neutron radiation ever, unless you're in the proper containment and isolation procedures and stuff like that. I've never actually physically dealt with it. I've more studied the theory of how it works. So one of the first nuclear batteries back to the topic, one of the first nuclear batteries that was ever invented used the isotope cobalt-60, which was refined out of some of the first nuclear reactors. And they put it inside a little box. And the little box had beta voltaic cells in the walls. And so what would happen is when the radioactive isotope would decay one of its neutrons into a proton and split off an electron. So I think it would become, what's the element above cobalt? Because when a neutron converts into a proton, it now has an extra proton in the nucleus, and so it's another type of atom. But what it would do is that the walls of this little box would absorb the electron that got shot off. And then it would then be able to store it, and then it would build a charge, probably in something like a capacitor or a battery. And so nuclear batteries are the technology of using radioactivity to make self-recharging batteries.
Yeah, so pretty much you'd be able to stack these things on top of each other and they would just charge themselves, right?
Yes, so if you made a whole bunch of them and properly shielded them, and it's a lot easier to just shield against beta radiation with what I said about how beta radiation really doesn't go through anything thicker than a piece of paper.
Using a piece of paper to own the libs.
Yeah, you can stop beta radiation to effectively the thickness of a piece of paper of any of matter. So you could make a whole bunch of beta voltaic battery cells, make a capacitor bank, and then if you had enough of them, the recharge rate would be to match the recharge rate with the power that you're using. You effectively have something equivalent to, say, if you had put solar panels on your roof, except that they work 24 hours a day. You have a constantly recharging electricity source. And so if somebody developed safe, efficient, and readily mass-producible nuclear battery technologies, and then just outfitted homes with them, your houses would produce their own electricity passively and be able to store it in a battery bank. Or hell, you could make a nuclear car battery, and then your car battery would probably never need to be replaced because it just recharges itself over time.
No, guys, I think we need to lobby the state to make more nuclear power plants.
Yeah, that's another thing about it. Is that all nuclear power is regulated by the state.
Why do you think there are none? Except for like a handful that only exist for the purpose of powering military bases.
I'll tell you the reason. I'll tell you another thing, is that nuclear power is so abundant. We have enough radioactive material that we could make nuclear batteries and nuclear power plants that electricity would become not a scarce resource at all. It might be even into the negative cost. Like it would cost like you could overproduce electricity with the amount of nuclear fuel we have. And we would have...
You'd have to pay somebody to get it from you?
Yes, like they would have to pay someone to take it at that level of generation. Yeah. And I can tell you the whole reason why this hasn't been applied is because they want the electricity grid to be a constant kind of... You rent your electricity from the utilities.
Right.
They want it to be that way, because it's another way that you don't own your own resources. Like, if you actually observe what the actual relationship is with all of your utilities, your water systems, your sewage, your garbage, your electricity, your internet, and if you actually start thinking about, well, how would I reduce the cost of this utility, this service, to zero? That's how you need to think if you want to subvert the existing societal engineering that keeps us trapped in the state's way of everything working.
Yeah, I mean, if you had like pretty much as much energy as you could need, and that would mean that you could produce pretty much almost anything that you need, what would the point be in working? Like, why would the state be able to make you go to work?
You would obsolete the need to work for other people. You could literally just create all of or recycle all of the resources you could ever need. And so the only other reasons that you would have to associate with people would be just genuine interest in your neighbors and wanting to trade design ideas or art or luxuries. You would literally obsolete the need to work for a living.
Right. And I was talking about in one of my podcasts, the one I did about AI with Dylan Dean, I was saying basically like anti-work, I mean, they have a point, even if their solution to it
even if they're cringy about it, they have a point.
Yeah, like they have a point, and like there's a reason that they feel this way toward it. And like, I mean, obviously it's not like going to be the best.
Do you really want to
my server, or not my server, sorry, in their Reddit and say like, oh, well, look, here's how you could have as much like power as you need, and then you won't have to work and whatever. I don't think I'm going to get many people listening to me from there, but like it would be a good point to somebody.
Do it for yourself.
If you were listening, yeah.
If you do it for yourself, you demonstrate by improving your life, and other people will see you prosper, and they'll want to copy you.
Yeah.
That's how you. That's literally how you just get other people on your side, is that you just be open with how you're doing things. Be open with how you improve your own life. And then share the method of how you improve your own life with those around you. And then it will just propagate to everyone.
I'm going to be right back.
Okay.
Yeah, and really like...
I have studied into this enough that I could probably give you at least a single example of how you would solve all of these minor things, minor pillars that maintain the societal norms that the state props up. Like all of the utilities, I could give you examples of how you could, like, there are already people who partially do this. Like, you ever heard of like people who go off grid or are like preppers, or like they make it so that they're as self-sufficient as possible. Well, what you really need to do is you need to take that mindset and you need to take that put that mindset to developing new tools. And if you develop an easy enough and easy to produce tool that achieves that specific basic need, and then you share that with everyone, you've now eliminated an entire chain that holds people into a certain way of living.
Right. And kind of what we've been talking about, it all funnels into one thing. And you mentioned this to me as sort of like what the idea of the episode really is that, you know, the method is something that people adopt when it's beneficial to them. It's not necessarily something that we're looking, or I guess, you know, looking to convince people on the ideology of, anarchism so that they start adopting this stuff. And it's not really like, it's a value-free thing, the method. It's something that people will adopt into their lives when they have so much utility from it that it just becomes ignorant to not do it.
Yeah, it becomes better to do it than to not do it for them, even just by observing how it affects those around them.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think that's the most effective way to actually create the condition of freedom, is that you actually have to create it for yourself and then share how you've created it for yourself and innovate on how you've done it in such a way that it makes it more easy to maintain and more efficient. And then release the blueprints to the things that you make to others around you. And eventually what you'll end up with is society will change around that, because you've subverted what keeps the artificially enforced society we have right now from continuing to exist.
Yeah.
By all practical matters.
And I was just going to ask, like, you know, we've kind of been streaming for a little bit, and I think we've actually really covered a lot of bases here, and we've pretty much wrapped up what we've talked about before the show, and I think we actually brought a lot of good points here as well today. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would love to keep going if that's okay, because I would like to actually go into each some of these points that I would like to bring up. Like, I know I brought up with you previously the idea of permaculture, right?
Yeah.
Where instead of factory farming, like the state subsidizes, if you instead terraform and re-engineer your actual property into like have you ever heard of the concept of a food forest?
You have told that to me.
That's one of the concepts of permaculture, where you, instead of planting a single kind of crop and then mowing it down and getting all of the food out of it in mass and then overproducing and then having to sell it off and all that, if instead, like, the idea of a food forest is to take the natural ecosystem and symbiotic relationships of how forests already work, like the interaction between the mycelial networks in the soil, the interaction between the bugs and the birds and the trees themselves, and the secondary plants that hold the soil, and the bacterial symbiosis for nitrogen fixing. And you analyze those relationships, and then you take specific species of food creating plants and healthy mushrooms, and you engineer a forest to have those symbiotic relationships with all food producing plants. You can create a self-sustaining farm, one that maintains itself just by the relationships of the plants and animals and fungus and other such organisms interacting with each other and reinforcing the pattern that has been created. And that's the idea of a food forest. It's one of the ideas of permaculture, where you just change the environment of your land so that all of the plants and animals in that space all interact and reinforce each other's relationship in such a way that it literally just is like an engineered Eden.
Right. And I mean, that's just coming back to the idea that this is really just to be able to sustain yourself and, be independent.
Yeah, you would just be able to go pick all of the food that you need year round out of such an environment. You would be a farmer, but a lot of the farming tools, you don't need them anymore because it will self-sustain itself. It will reproduce itself, and I'll give you a perfect example of this. So, previous human civilizations have already figured out the concept of permaculture, and entire civilizations were actually built on it. So, and I'll give you an example that's going to be so baffling that you'll be in shock. The Amazon rainforest is a permaculture. The Amazon rainforest is an engineered environment. The soil in the Amazon rainforest was maintained by the peoples there in such a way where they broke up pieces of pottery and they burned plants that were dead and turned it into charcoal and mixed it into the soil. And so the actual soil of the Amazon rainforest is something called what is it? Amazon rainforest soil name. Terra very dark, fertile Amazonian anthropogenic soil. Literally, Portuguese translation to black soil. It was engineered. Almost all of the plants in the Amazon rainforest have an engineered symbiosis with each other that reproduced itself. And when the Amazon rainforest went wild, when the civilizations collapsed due to infighting and due to the invasion of the Spaniards and other colonists spreading plague to them because they weren't immune to it, the forest didn't die when they stopped maintaining it. It continued reproducing itself. It continued reinforcing itself. The terra preta soil of the Amazon rainforest is self-reproducing. They've engineered the way that it interacts with the bacteria and the nutrients to reproduce itself, which means that the ancient cultures of the Amazon rainforest had such an understanding of how the environment interacted with each other, with itself, that they had a knowledge that we're only just rediscovering.
Yeah, wow.
It is outstanding. There are so many medical plants, there are so many fruit plants, there are so many actually beneficial plants in the Amazon rainforest. When you actually analyze how they got that way, it was engineered. It had to have been engineered.
Yeah, that is a pretty good example of that. I think
which goes to show that permaculture is the way to actually engineer rainforests. You want to solve all of this climate change stuff that the state is always terrorizing people about? Terraform the environment.
The real activism.
Yeah.
That is one of the best examples I can give you of where methodology will directly affect your outcome.
Yeah, it makes it so people aren't dependent on proprietors for their food source, and simultaneously makes it so everyone in the societies around that permaculture have a vested interest in defending it because it's their food source.
And that's only one example. That would completely destroy the factory farming model if you could make it so that large swaths of land were just self-sustaining, engineered ecosystems. And you could do this with existing plants. You wouldn't need to bioengineer them. But I can tell you that bioengineering would probably actually assist this.
No more bleached chicken. Finally.
I'm actually a supporter of genetic engineering. I think it's amazing and breakthrough technology. But what is so tragic about it is that it's been monopolized by corporations. And so you see what has happened because of that is that it's being used as a weapon against people.
Yeah, what I'm really talking about here is the like the cleaning process that they do for a lot of chicken, especially in the United States, which is like they actually like pretty much clean it in a big vat of bleach. Like, I mean, it's a watered down thing, I'd assume, but it just contains that, and it can get into the chicken, and also just the way they feed animals, especially like with chicken or well, I don't know about pork specifically, but like usually like corn and soy fed stuff is just not good for your health because of the way it goes into the polyunsaturated fat. And it just makes it not healthy to consume as much so as like a ruminant animal with that isn't monogastric. So like you'd have less of a worry with cows right now, but stuff like a chicken like is actually something I don't eat as frequently because of that.
And I'm betting that this bird flu thing that the state was using as an excuse to cull all of those chickens was just a hoax. Or even if it was real, they were using it to try and control the food, the people maintaining their own chickens. Because the way that the state agents of like the disease control agency went about containing the bird flu is that if a single chicken got the flu, instead of isolating that chicken from the rest of the chickens, they ordered the farmers to cull all of their chickens.
It sounds like what they do with nursing homes. But yeah,
So
like no,
I've given you an example of how you would collapse factory farming as a state enforced method of organization. I've given you at least one example of how you would subvert the power companies by making power sources available to everyone. Now let's go into the water. Now say that you had your own land and you were connected to the city water and you set it up. You had this whole thing where you disconnected from the city water and dug your own well. Now, the government will probably go, in some places, actually come against you with cops for trying to dig your own well illegally. And I can tell you that something that I've just started researching is how come no one's ever considered like taking the concept of a dehumidifier, making it efficient, and then using it to suck the ambient humidity out of the air, and then putting that through a filter and then storing that in the water tank.
Yeah, that is interesting.
This is me putting the idea out there that could practically subvert the centralized water supply. If you could make portable ways of just taking the ambient humidity and turning that into a water source.
Yeah, I'd recommend you reverse osmosis that water.
Yeah, in a lot of environments, that would probably work very well. That would be like having the effect of having your own well water, as long as you were in a high humidity environment. And there are plenty of environments like that across the world. That would be one practical example I could think of that would subvert people's reliance on the centralized water pipe systems, making it so that water could cost nothing as long as you have electricity. See, it's kind of predicated on the other inventions, isn't it?
That's true.
Being able to have your own power sources means that you can put that power towards other things.
This dehumidifier thing, so like that would be something you place outside and like it funnels in.
Yeah, just like your your big central air conditioning fan thing unit that connects to your house. You could have something like that an addition to that device that just filters out the ambient humidity, or at least 1% of it, because you don't want dry air in your house. That would suck.
And sorry, I'm kind of just sitting back here and not saying anything. There's not really much that I can add to this conversation.
That's fine. This is more of me going into things that I've personally researched or thought about, because I want to actually put ideas out there about how you would practically subvert the central utilities and all of the things that hold up how society is forced to organize in its current fashion.
Fair enough. I guess I just I guess we're back to this being, the stream where it's mainly centered around talking around engineering.
Well, yeah, that's kind of what I wanted this to be.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just, yeah. I guess my section's done.
Yeah, all right, for now. But to continue, so I've covered one practical example of how you could take care of your own food. Just terraform, like you could literally just rip out your lawn, remove all your grass, and then just put in, like, I don't know, wild strawberries. Like, put in plants so that you don't have to constantly waste gasoline mowing your lawn. Like, why have a lawn? Like, why have just plain old grass that you're just going to mow over and over and over again? Why have these monotonous tasks that do nothing? It's
because
just wasting
the HOA
time.
will put a deed on your home.
Yeah, that's another fucking disgusting thing that needs to die. HOAs. It's another thing that can only exist because of state enforced property.
Well, that's how it works. And so it's to
But
answer your
again,
question.
But again, you could literally just remove all of your grass and put in mulch. Then you never have to mow again. Maybe just remove some weeds. But really, you could solve the weed problem too by just putting in a plant that is helpful, that has the aggressiveness of a weed. And then it will just outcompete all the weeds, and the weeds will just die.
Yeah. And, I was going to say, like, property values. I mean, like, that's like kind of the justification, or not justification, but I'd say, like, the reason that HOAs are around as well. It's because they can enforce that sort of thing, so that the property value system, like, is a thing.
Yeah.
So, I mean, obviously you have to keep your garden nice and pretty, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, grow your own food, find ways to get your own power, find ways to get your own water source. Now, about trash. I know trash is kind of a difficult topic with all of the plastics and all of these artificial materials that we have to deal with nowadays. But something to really consider is that most trash can actually just be composted. You can turn that into soil. Just get worms and then just get a big box and do that. The only reason I'm not doing that current... Huh?
What about stuff like plastic?
Plastic? I would actually recommend you get something like it's called a filimaker, right? You just melt the plastics you already have and turn it into printer filament.
Okay, yeah.
I think that's a good thing you could do with that, and then you just like turn the plastic into things you actually need.
I was looking up how to recycle PLA, like yourself, and I was seeing like some of the devices that were being sold were just expensive, and I'm like, well, do I really want to spend that money to recycle my PLA?
And you know what would subvert that?
What?
Making a rep printer that could print one.
Yeah.
just make a manufacturing device that allows you to make the components of the thing you need to make, and then you just make it.
Right.
Like there's like I don't know if a lot of people are aware of this, but someone has already invented a way to print circuit boards. There's already a device that can do that. Like if you look it up on YouTube, there's like it would take me a moment to go look it up myself. I might have it bookmarked, but somebody's already invented that. Sure, it's kind of expensive, but once you get one, as long as you have the raw material, you can just make circuit boards and then just purchase the electronic components yourself and assemble a circuit board.
Interesting. Random question, does the material that you feed into these kinds of printers, like, is it the same kind of way that PLA is, like, or any other, like string of like filament, where it's kind of coming in that like that string form? Like, would you have to do that with like metal and so on? Like, would you have to make your own rolls of it?
I guess you could, but I don't think that's the efficient design you want to go for.
Okay.
I think what would actually be better is to use lasers to actually harden metal suspended in a liquid into the like basically use lasers to actually build it layer by layer as a crystal, like use it as a catalyst. So you could literally just build the material up in the submerged catalyst one layer at a time. Sort of, it's not actually printing it, like you're not actually having like a 3D printer head that's melting the thing and then, because there's already been an invented metal printer What I'm describing would be something more like a fabricator, something that would actually just build it up layer by layer.
Okay.
It would be different. You wouldn't need to heat up the metal. You're just crystallizing it in place.
Interesting. Yeah.
Of course, you would
definitely need to
need the
look more into that.
precision of maybe like nanometer scale, but still, even if you just got like 100 nanometers, you would be able to make glasses at home. You would be able to make lenses that normally cost lens kits that normally cost $75,000.
Man. Yeah,
Make your own telescopes, make your own binoculars, make your own. You could probably even make a photonic computer chip if you tried hard enough. Again, once you unlock the ability to manufacture materials at that scale, like, the sky's the limit on things that you could probably invent at that point, especially because you'd be able to make all of the components to assemble together.
All right. Did you have other areas that you were looking to speak on?
Well, let's see. What are some other things that are influences on? Oh yes, internet. This is where I wanted to go into the FNet project, why the original version of it failed, and why the second version of it also failed, but didn't fail in concept. Like, if I just describe how it worked, anyone listening to this would probably be able to recreate it. So right now, if you were to go look up something called the Wi-Fi Pineapple, there are these little portable routers that you can install a Linux OS on, install firmware on. And there's this software, which is a Linux distribution called OpenWRT, that's supposed to be in embedded hardware. It's basically open source router firmware. And now the idea for FNet version 2, the replacement for the failed CJDNS IPFS idea, was to just modify a firmware image of OpenWRT to include a mesh networking routing protocol into the OpenWRT firmware, and then install that on a mini router that you could plug in via USB, making it so that you could just get these pre-formatted with this modified firmware. And what the idea we had is that we would just get them ourselves, format the modified firmware onto them, and then sell them to people pre-configured. But we wouldn't be making any of it proprietary. We would just release the firmware if people wanted to make it themselves. We would just make it easy for people who didn't want to go through the effort of doing all of the configuring. But the idea, anyone could still do if they have the technical knowledge to work with firmware, and have the knowledge of how routers work, and have the interest in learning how OpenWRT works. So you yourself could recreate the FNet project and create your own subversion of your local ISPs. And that's what I'm leading into here with this topic here, is that one of the big last pillars that's holding up the white market of the state is the monopoly on communications, is the ISP's control over what you can and can't do with your internet, is who you can and can't connect to and how. That the IP protocol is standardized and enforced by ICANN, which is the government-run work group that maintains the internet backbone, the highest level ISP that connects the countries together, and all of the other ISPs connect to that. So if you could subvert that, you subvert the centralized communications network. You literally make it so that internet could be as close to free as possible. It could cost nothing, just by setting up portable routers that mesh network together, making it so that you could just communicate with any computer in your house, communicate with your phone, and if you sold these to your neighbors, or at least showed them how to set them up themselves, you could create a mesh network internet throughout your neighborhood. Wow. And at that point, you could literally just like how Tor works, how you bounce internet traffic off of one node to another node to another node to reach the destination. This would be like the hardware equivalent of that. That's how mesh networking works. And it would practically subvert the ISP's control over the local internet.
And you said like this was the first version that you were working on.
This is the second version that we didn't get to continue working on because we didn't have people to actually work on it with.
Right.
But me just describing how it works, if people review this video and listen to this specific part of it, they'll be able to understand if they know what I'm talking about with these parts, or just look it up themselves and have the technical knowledge. They would be able to recreate the idea of FNet. And that's what matters. That somebody out there listens to this and then recreates the idea of FNet in practical, practical application, because that would improve a significant, destroy a significant bottleneck in people's day-to-day communications.
For sure. So I definitely have had a great time on the show. I think it's time we wrap things up. If you do have anything else you wanted to add as like final thoughts, that would be welcome. SO as well. If you just had anything like overarching for the show. But yeah, I mean, overall, like great stream. I think
I've covered as much as I really need to.
Yeah.
Because people already know that cryptocurrency subverts the central bank system. And the reason why cryptocurrency hasn't taken off and directly defeated fiat yet is because of the monopoly on communication. So that's why if you subvert the standard practices in communication and create a distributed and decentralized mesh network-based internet, that would make it so that there would be entire networks of people who could be able to use that as a direct means of payment. They wouldn't have to fight through the existing internet protocols and standards to make their things work.
See, I agree with what you said, but you call it fiat?
Fiat currency.
Interesting. Usually I hear fiat. I've never heard that pronunciation. That's just interesting. But
who cares?
Did you have any other thoughts, or SO, if you had any other thoughts, let me know.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add that I didn't already contribute. Doug explained the material, mechanical side of what would actually go into designing subversive techniques pretty well. And I just identified what specific norms and behavior actually, for practical reasons, engineer the social norms that make it possible for the state to continue functioning as society's center.
Okay.
And I pretty much talked about what are the practical actions and what are the targets you would need to subvert to actually make it happen.
Yeah, I don't really have anything else to say.
Sure. And if you had a time frame, if you wanted to include it on that essay you're working on, Doug?
I don't know. It's really just when I get around to it, because I think this is the second time I've had to go through and rewrite the whole script, because it started with me just trying to describe why copyright and intellectual property and licensing is a problem, and why the Free Software Foundation won't achieve its goal, because it's appealing to the copyright system in the way it's actually approaching free and open source. Because free and open source software is not enough. It has to also be subversive, or it gets integrated into the system it's trying to fight. And you see that's exactly what happened with Linux and all of the other open source software movements. Corporations adapted to it. They didn't actually get undermined by it.
All right. So with that, you guys can be found at Backalley Philosophy on YouTube, and I can be found here at Civil Offense. Make sure you like, comment, subscribe. You can find me on social media at Civil Offense, and remember that Civil Offense is the key to winning. Thank you.